thank you for the introduction, and also thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this marvelous event. I do realize I'm a little bit an odd woman out in this company, not only because I'm not neither Finnish nor Swedish, but also because the content of what I'm going to say is going to be slightly different. So our think tank, which is called the European Values, in recent years has been focusing on security matters, but not in terms of hard security, but more soft security, and I'm going to explain that in a little bit. If you want to know a little bit more about us, there's a website and also a newsletter that we produce every week, which I can only recommend you to subscribe to. We have been established in 2005, and originally we were focusing much more on the European Union policies and politics, explaining what it means for Czechs to become members of the European Union. But throughout the years, so security issues became much more important in our context, and we switched our focus in that area. Very shortly after the annexation of Crimea and after the start of the war in eastern Ukraine, we started noticing an increase of disinformation campaigns in the Czech online media space especially. And what we started doing was monitoring these campaigns, exposing them, cooperating with the EEAS East Stratcom task force within the European Union. And shortly after that, what we realized was that disinformation campaigns are not isolated tools of influence of other countries, that they are often interconnected with other measures and other tools. Some of them are more visible, some of them are more subtle. And what we also realized was that we are not the only ones who are being the target of these campaigns. What we believe is that there is general 7 categories of influence operations or influence tools, and each and every country, the combination of the important tools that are being used is different and tailored according to the general domestic context. So apart from the disinformation operations or disinformation campaigns, which I think at this time are a fairly known and common topic of discussion, there is also a noticeable increase in intelligence and espionage operations in many countries, especially in Central Eastern Europe, but elsewhere as well. We can see that Russia is trying to, especially Russia, but also other, obviously, authoritarian regimes, are trying to gain political allies, often quite high-positioned. They are establishing NGOs or gungos, so basically fake NGOs, which are legitimizing Russian aggressive policies in Ukraine and other Russian narratives. Sometimes they support radical and extremist groups. They can, in specific countries, use parts of ethnic minority, not only for espionage itself, but also, again, using them as a legitimizing group for their decision-making and foreign policy. And they also use economic operations, which have, in reality, political goals. So, as I said, in each country, I believe the combination of the tools which are most important is different. So, for example, in the Czech Republic, apart from disinformation campaigns, we have seen an increasing effort to gain political allies, not only in the parliament, but also in very high-level positions. So, for example, our president is very responsive to any influence operations, and he has been one of the greatest defenders, I think, in Central Europe of Russian policies, including its efforts in Ukraine and Crimea. These operations can influence the voters, the citizens. They are often undermining their trust into democratic institutions, also mainstream and public media. And they're often attacking the relevance of the EU and NATO membership of European countries. That's why, because these efforts can have influence on our geopolitical decision-making and our political decision-making, we think that these efforts should be accepted as a matter of internal security, not only foreign policy. So this is a model representation that we created of what we think the Kremlin is trying to do in European countries, what is the ideal process, and what can be done to limit it or even to set it back. This is, as I said, model representation, so specific details might differ from region to region. But generally the influence is being projected in the beginning by finding some contact points based on either financial support, media support, ideology, looking for certain individuals with high influence who can then defend or even promote Russian policies. What is, I think, the most important point on the red circle is the strategic deal on the downside. This is connected to the economic operations that I mentioned. Very often Russia and Russian state companies are trying to make strategic deals, especially in the energy sector, but also in other areas. And after such a strategic deal is made, especially if it hasn't been done by a fair process, transparent process, this can be a point after which it's very difficult to return to the original state of play. After such a deal, it's much easier for the influence operations and strategy to limit the opposition. And I guess the worst case scenario is the soft regime change, which hasn't been particularly common. I think somewhere near the end of the red circle we might find countries like Belarus or Serbia where Russian influence has become incorporated into the domestic structures. And of course there are certain steps that any country can do to either limit such process or even defend itself against it, or maybe even avoid it at all. And I'm going to talk about these specific steps and group of countries later. So when we started our research in the beginning, we were mostly focusing on the Czech context. And considering the Czech Republic is one of the countries which is facing many of these challenges, and also has started to take some specific steps, which are small, but they are there, to counter our democratic system, to defend our democratic system against them, I would maybe give you a few examples from our country. So 2 years ago, we decided to measure how many people are actually vulnerable to disinformation campaigns. This type of research hasn't been done in many countries, and we don't have a lot of comparative data, so this is really just a case study of the Czech Republic. And what we found out is that between 25 and 40% of people believe in the most common disinformation narratives. So, for example, 50% of the public thinks that the refugees from Syria specifically are the responsibility of the United States, that the whole crisis a few years ago or months ago has been caused by the United States. Also, 38% of people think that US and NATO are responsible for the Ukrainian crisis. Over 30% of respondents told us that fascists have a crucial influence on the Ukrainian government. And why this was helpful for us to know these data is because then we can tell policymakers that disinformation campaigns can actually have influence on their political options. So imagine you are a Minister of Foreign Affairs, and there's more than a quarter of your population who believes that fascists are a relevant political strength in Ukraine, and you want to support Ukrainians. It's very difficult to do. Great. So what the Czech government did to counter or address these issues? I think the first steps were really taken in 2015. I believe the Czech government got sort of awakened after the start of the war in Ukraine. And they started to realize that this topic is something that we do need to talk about, that this is not just an issue of Ukraine, but also of our region. After the government decided or created at least partial consensus on supporting the sanctions, what started happening is that we started updating our strategic documents, specifically our strategy of foreign policy and our security strategy. And this was an important step. The foreign policy strategy actually mentioned Russia as one of the security threats, while the security strategy didn't mention Russia by name, but started to describe hybrid threats as one of the priorities in our security and internal security. What happened is that one of the Czech representatives or seconded national experts was sent to the EAS East Stratcom Task Force. So this is a small unit in Brussels within the EU, which is dealing with mostly pro-Russian or Kremlin-based disinformation. They are collecting cases of such disinformation, and they have a public database where you can browse them and see the trends. Also, the Czech civil society at that point, including our think tank, started to address this issue. In 2016, our government made a very important and crucial step. It conducted a national security audit. So that was basically a review of our strengths and weaknesses in different new security areas, including terrorism, cybersecurity, but also there was a chapter which was called Foreign Power Influence. Each chapter had a civil society consultant, which I think was an important contribution from the non-governmental sector. And the result of this audit was a set of recommendations, what are our biggest vulnerabilities and how to cover them. There was also a set of action plans, which are not public, however. Based on that audit, a Center Against Terrorism and Hybrid Threats has been established at the Czech Ministry of Interior. It is a small strategic communication unit which specifically focuses on disinformation campaigns which might have an impact on our internal security. And again, I think it's very important and symbolical that this unit was incorporated into the Interior Ministry, not into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or Defense. This small unit was often accused of censorship and many other things. However, they have no such powers. They can only monitor the media space, they can acknowledge disinformation campaigns early, and they can communicate with the public, set the record straight. They can notify other state agencies and institutions that there is a disinformation campaign being conducted, which might have some implications for their work. At that point, we also sent one of our representatives to the NATO Stratcom Center of Excellence. And countering disinformation and generally the focus on influence operations has slowly become an integral part of the Czech foreign policy. The Czech Republic also started to support Russian language independent media, and in the long term we have also, so in Prague there is a headquarters of the Radio for Europe, which also has a Russian language branch, which I think also was pretty significant for us. And then finally in 2017 the center, which I mentioned, started being fully operational, so now it's over a year that it is in place. The action plan has many other recommendations and points which are currently being implemented still. There was also a task force established for protection of the elections, because a year ago we had parliamentary as well as presidential elections in the Czech Republic. And last but not least, our defense strategy also got updated in order to incorporate hybrid threats as one of the priorities. So that's a small example of what was happening in the Czech Republic. The situation isn't ideal, but it is, I think, good that at least this topic is becoming a part of the public and political debate, and that some steps are being taken. When you look at our website, kremlinwatch.eu, you will find a map of European countries, and you can actually check each one of them and find what is happening in these countries in terms of strategic communication, countering foreign influence and disinformation campaigns. We try to rank these countries, specifically EU member states, according to 3 criteria. We have done that twice already. This study is being updated each year. The criteria that we use for ranking a few countries and their response to foreign influence operations are first political acknowledgement, which means do strategic documents in that country acknowledge hybrid threats or disinformation campaigns as a point of interest. Do the political representatives acknowledge it? Do they talk about it publicly and explain what it means for the country? The second criterion was governmental countermeasures. So these are specific steps that are being taken to defend or counter these operations. It might be strategic communication frameworks or new institutions. It also might be programs funding media literacy. It might be support of civil society in that area, and many other things that can be done. And the third criterion that we have was publicly known counterintelligence activities. So this again means do, for example, annual reports of the counterintelligence agency mention foreign espionage and describe it properly? Do they expel agents publicly or non-publicly, etc.? So this is the list of the countries as it was in May last year. We are currently working on an updated version, but it still shows some of the developments from the last 2 or 3 years. We have 5 groups of countries. We decided to name the categories a little bit more provocatively because we are using it as basically an advocacy tool, which is why the group, the first group is called Kremlin collaborators, and you can find Cyprus and Greece in this category, and this is basically because many measures that are being taken by these countries are actually helping or even welcoming Russian influence. And sometimes they are also limiting the civil society response to them. The second group, countries in denial, are countries which are basically denying there's any such problem. You can find Hungary there, but also Slovenia or Austria. Austria got to this group especially because, or after the whole scandal within its security services, and because it actually became one of the less trustworthy countries when it comes to sharing information about also its allies with the Russian Federation. We have a group of hesitant countries like Slovakia or Bulgaria. Often these countries, or even Belgium, often these countries do not deny there is a problem, but there are several reasons why they're in this category. Either they think this is only a problem of Eastern Europe, and not their own. Sometimes they do have some initiatives on strategic communication, but they're mostly focusing on, for example, Islamic propaganda and other topics, or they are geographically so far away that they just don't consider this their point of interest. The biggest group that is there is a group called the Awakened, and these are mostly the countries which, as the Czech Republic did, got awakened by the Ukrainian crisis and started taking at least some partial steps, which are not very well coordinated, and we can discuss their efficiency, but there is at least some provocation of the debate. Apart from the Czech Republic, countries that you can find here are, for example, Spain, the Netherlands, France, or Germany, and also Finland. And the group A, the downside group, the group that we think shows the most significant best practices, which we believe should be replicated in the rest of the countries, are UK, Sweden, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which we call the full-scale defenders. This doesn't mean that in these countries there is no hypothetical place for improvements, but compared to the other groups, in these countries the most is being done. That's basically the same just on the map, so you can see that the Awakened group is probably the biggest one. So these are some changes that we noticed between the first and second version of this report. We've seen an increase of political acknowledgement in Croatia, which started to be more active on the EU level and calling for a stronger European response. We have Slovakia, which updated its strategic documents, which, without attribution to the Russian Federation or any other authoritarian regime, did mention propaganda and disinformation as a threat. We have Spain, which, especially after the referendum about the Catalonian independence, started to debate the impact of Russian-based automated bots on social media and their influence on the referendum. And we also have France, which started a discussion about new legislative proposal to tackle disinformation in the pre-election term. we have Denmark, which improved especially in the governmental countermeasures area, and also a new institution, new interministerial task force established there. Then Danish soldiers are being trained to recognize and combat disinformation, and that was one of the, I think, biggest improvements that we've seen. We have UK, which started being active, especially on the parliamentary level and regarding different investigations about Russian influence into the Brexit referendum, but also after the case of the attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal and his daughter. And we have Sweden, which showed a lot of best practices step in preparation for the elections. Many countries from the Awakened group actually start to realize this problem only after they notice some type of influence into their elections, and only after the elections are over, which is obviously too late. And we think it's very very good that Sweden actually started to take some precautions before the elections and the campaigns took place. Then we have countries which moved down the ladder. I would maybe mention the Netherlands, which despite huge problems which encountered the referendum about the association agreement with Ukraine and the shutting down of the MH17 flight, and extensive disinformation campaigns which were surrounding these two events, stopped supporting the EU-level task force. We have Germany, which, despite the fact that we were hoping that Germany might become one of the leaders in this fight, got stagnant and basically stopped discussing this issue because of the Nord Stream 2 and other economic and energy issues. Then we have also the Czech Republic, which after the elections we have a far-right party in the parliament. It's basically a one-issue movement focused on denying or avoiding accepting any refugees or migrant from the Middle East to the Czech Republic, and they hold a lot of very obviously pro-Russian views. They are led by a Japanese person, just if you were interested. This is just an indicative table when it comes to the public counterintelligence operations. This is the number of agents which were expelled from different countries after the Skripal case. So I believe that both Finland and Sweden expelled one agent after that. And we think that this general action of common action of expelling agents from the European territory was a nice symbolic move. However, the numbers are very low, and in practice, it hasn't really meant anything specific for the Russian Federation. It was really just a symbolic move. So, how to tailor and implement a strategy to counter Russian influence and protect your democracy against influence operations. I will not go through all of the countries because we have specific sets of recommendations for each of the group. I will speak about the Awaken countries because there is actually most potential to be doing something and improve the already existing initiatives. So where we think each country should start is ensuring transparent financing of political candidates. In today's environment, we often see that the current legislation is not enough to take care of foreign funding of political candidates, but also it's true that in many countries it's a problem with transparency of the media. In the Czech Republic we have an immense number of websites which are quite popular, where we have no idea where they come from, who publishes there, and who finances them. I already mentioned the national security documents. We think that unless foreign policy strategies and security strategies name this problem, the hybrid threats, the disinformation campaigns, as a threat and as a priority, then it's very difficult for any policymakers and for any state institutions to act upon this and address this problem. So this is usually a good start. We should investigate and scrutinize actors who are relentlessly defending Kremlin's policies despite these policies are often aggressive towards us. I'm speaking about parliamentary committees which can investigate publicly some of the public officials, but also I'm talking about investigative journalism here and civil society, which sometimes doesn't have the resources, but it certainly can publicly challenge these people and ask them why. What is the reason behind their behavior? Establishing specialized institutions like the strategic communication centers is, I think, a step that should be only taken after the previous steps have taken place. We have seen bad examples of institutions being established to counter disinformation. I can mention Ukraine, which established the whole Ministry of Information, and their activity has been ineffective at best. However, if such institutions are transparent, if they communicate well to the public what is it they are doing and what is their goal in the public debate, they can help a lot the government and the democratic institution generally to stay on track when it comes to disinformation campaign and to communicate well with the public so that such disinformation campaign don't get traction. In ideal case, I guess such a strategic communication unit should be established in all the relevant ministries which are in one way or the other dealing with security, so not only interior ministries but also foreign policy ministries and defense ministries. We can review our legal tools. In some cases we might find out that even though we are not implementing well, that we already have legislation in place that can help us, especially when it comes to, for example, the transparency of the media. We should understand the attitudes in the society. I mentioned the polling that we did a few years ago. I think that such research should be done in all of the countries and ideally repeatedly so that we can see the trends of differences between regions, that we can see which disinformation are effective in which country. And it would also help us to understand what are our vulnerabilities and which specific steps should be a priority for us specifically. We should train policymakers and decision makers not only to recognize disinformation but also in terms of cybersecurity, operational security, recognizing when somebody is trying to extract information from them. And we have seen that this is a problem all over Europe. We should push for a common European response. The East Stratcom Task Force I mentioned is still being highly under-resourced, personally and financially. There has been some improvement in recent months when the European Commission accepted the new action plan against disinformation, but the member states should still monitor how this action plan is being implemented, if the money are going to the right places, and they should send their representatives not only to the Stratcom Task Force but also to the Center of Excellences in Riga and here in Helsinki, which are very relevant for strategic communication and disinformation. And they should use these institutions. They should consult with them. They can ask them for common exercises, for example, when it comes to hybrid threats. And last but not least, adequate education, not only of the policymakers, but also media literacy education in high schools, media literacy of the elderly, because that has been a huge problem, I think, everywhere. People who are usually the most disciplined voters have no idea how to fact check or how to find information online. And we also need more sophisticated programs in the universities, not only for teachers but also for experts on Russia, so that we know a little bit better what is happening inside the country and understand a little bit more about their processes and motivations. So I won't go through the rest of them because I believe we can talk about any specifics during the Q&A session. So I would just once more like to invite you to our website where you can go through all the details. You can find all the country chapters and all the policy recommendations that we have. And I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards. So thank you for your attention.